Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to Biology 112. Dr. E here. Um, we are starting a new unit. So this unit is going to cover chapters 51, 52, 53, 54, 56. So see the syllabus if you need a reminder on what those chapters are about. But this unit will wrap up the rest of the semester, so the next 2.5 weeks or so. All right, and this is chapter 51, so I've split it up into a couple of videos. And so let's get started. So first of all, um, what we're talking about is ecology. So what is ecology? Ecology is just the study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. So all organisms are going to live in a particular environment, and they're going to interact with it in different ways. So you'll see that as we progress. But first, let's define a few aspects of the environment. So here's a few vocab words that you can use on your final exam. Biotic versus abiotic. Biotic is all the organisms found in a particular place. So the biotic is simply the living organisms that are part of the environment. The abiotic is the non-living factors of a particular place, including temperature, moisture, soil pH, precipitation, and so on. So organisms are going to interact with the other biotic aspects of their environment. So a squirrel is going to interact with an oak tree and a hawk. And it's also going to interact with the abiotic factors of its environment. So it's going to be affected by the rain or the lack of rain. It's going to be affected by winter temperatures and summer temperatures and so on and so forth. In the environment, we can also split it up into different sections or different spaces. So the hydrosphere encompasses all the water. So this would, when we're talking about the hydrosphere of Earth, for example, we're talking about the oceans and lakes and polar ice caps, basically anywhere that you find water. The lithosphere is basically all of the rocks and sediments and soils found on the surface of the Earth. The atmosphere is all of the gases and particles that wrap around the Earth. So basically, on the surface of the Earth, it's just the hydrosphere and the lithosphere, and then the air above us, the space above us, is where the atmosphere is. And all of this comes together to create the biosphere. So the biosphere is basically where all living organisms reside. It's basically the sum of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere. So ecology studies how organisms interact with their environment and vice versa. And you can see that ecology deals with different levels of organization. So in the picture on the right, you can see basically our planet broken down into tiers or into layers. So at the top is the biosphere. So this is basically just everything that we talked about on the last slide. The biosphere is split up into ecosystems. So an ecosystem is a community and its non-living surroundings. So an ecosystem is just the particular biotic and abiotic factors of in a particular region. The ecosystem is made up of communities. So communities focus on the biotic. So communities are populations that live together in a particular place. So in this example, we've got hawks and snakes and dogs and grass. So notice that they're all biotic components. And notice also that they're different species. So communities are made up of different species. Those species come together as populations. So a population is a group of one species of organism that lives in a particular place at a particular time. So in this example, we've got a population of bison. So if we're studying a population, we're only dealing with one species, and we're only dealing with the population of that species in a particular location. So it might be the bison of Wyoming, or the bison of Yellowstone National Park, or the bison that live in the southwest corner of Yellowstone National Park, whatever. And then below that is the organism. So an organism is an individual species, an individual thing. You and I are organisms. And this is basically the ground floor of ecology. So if we go below organisms, we get into cells and molecules and atoms and subatomic particles and all that fun stuff. But ecology doesn't really deal with that. Ecology is going to focus its attention on these upper realms. So organism is kind of the bottom end. Really, ecology is going to focus on populations and communities and ecosystems. So they'll venture into biosphere and organisms, but these three layers are where ecology um, main focus is. So if someone is going to study organisms in the context of ecology, they're going to practice organismal ecology. If they're going to study populations, they're going to study population ecology. If they're going to study communities, then they're going to study community ecology. All right, so you'll see that as we move forward over the next couple of chapters. Sometimes we'll look at populations, sometimes we'll look at communities, sometimes we'll look at ecosystems. But for this chapter, we're primarily going to focus up here. We're going to be looking at the biosphere. So we're going to start big and work our way down to the population level primarily. What's this? Yeah, okay, so in an ecosystem, you can see that there's living and non-living factors. So in this ecosystem, we've got sunlight, we've got rainfall, there's minerals in the soil. And then within that ecosystem, we might study a community. So we might study the plant community or the animal community or the plant and animal community. So the point is, these things are all nested. So organisms are nested within populations, populations are nested within communities, communities are nested within ecosystems, and then ecosystems are nested within the biosphere. Ecology is a science, it's a branch of science, a discipline of science, and so it uses the scientific method, so observation and experimentation. And ecology, because it's dealing with the interactions of organisms and because it's dealing oftentimes in large scales, you're going to see that there's going to be lots of examples of models. So ecology, to be a good ecologist, you have to be good at math. And the reason for that is because they're dealing with interactions, they often use mathematics to model the interactions between different species or between population and the abiotic environment or whatever. And so as a part of these mathematical models, oftentimes they will get their data to plug into them from two types of studies, field studies and lab studies. So this ecologist, she's out in the field, right, up to her knees in muck. And so ecology often collects data in the field. So here you will interact with actual populations. You might trap animals or collect plant samples or bacteria samples or whatever. Compare that with laboratory studies. In laboratory studies, you might be studying the same organisms, but you have to capture them or sample them and bring them back into the lab. The reason I'm highlighting this is field studies have pros and cons, as do laboratory studies. So the benefits of a field study is you're looking at an organism in its environment. So you're taking actual data on organisms that are living in a particular ecosystem. And that's good because that's giving you a realistic interaction with the living world. You're studying it where it's actually living and growing. So that's good. The problem is that in field studies, you might be limited. So you might not be able to sample, every cougar that you're trying to study. So you have to sample a subset of the population. Or maybe the animals are afraid of you, and so your presence in the environment is going to cause their behavior to shift, so your data might be skewed. You might not be able to get as many samples. Maybe another factor could be that you can't control the behavior of the animals. You can't control if their population crashes or if it grows quickly. You can't control the amount of sunlight or the amount of precipitation, and so you have less control over your experiment. In a laboratory study, you have control over those factors. You can control the temperature and the precipitation and the length of day. Maybe you can collect your samples in high numbers, but the problem is you're in a lab. So you've removed these organisms from their environment, from their ecosystem, and so you're always worried that maybe what you're observing in the lab isn't going to translate to real life. So oftentimes what scientists do is they'll begin with a lab study where they can control some of the factors, and then they'll go out to the field to test. They'll build a model off that, and then they'll go back to the field in order to test if those parameters were accurate or that model was accurate. For my PhD, that's what I did. I worked with bugs in a lab, and then I came up with some ideas and then went out and looked at it in the field to see if it translated. And some of it did, some of it didn't. Okay, so we're going to start big with the biosphere. So first up, when you're thinking about the Earth as a whole, one of the really important factors to where organisms live, where they do, is solar radiation. So maybe you know this, the sun shines on the Earth. And what's interesting is the Earth, because it's a sphere, it means that the solar radiation, the electromagnetic waves coming from the sun, is what we call sunlight. They hit different parts of the Earth with different intensities. So in this picture from your book, you can see that here at the equator, the sunlight is shining directly on the equator, and so the sunlight is rather focused on a relatively small area. Up here closer to the poles, because of the curve of the Earth, the solar radiation hits the surface of the Earth and it gets spread out over a larger area. Why am I talking about this? Well, this is one of the main reasons that it's hot at the equator and it's cold at the poles. At the equator, it gets direct sunlight, so there's more energy per square meter that gets transferred to the surface of the Earth that results in higher temperatures, whereas as you increase in latitude, as you move towards the poles, that same amount of solar radiation is going to get spread out over a larger area, and so that's going to result in colder temperatures. So what we see is that the equator tends to be warm, and as you move north towards the North Pole or south towards the South Pole, the overall temperatures tend to drop, become lower. There's other factors too, like the thickness of the atmosphere and so on, but we'll skip those for now. And this will we'll come back to this too as we talk about seasonality in the next slides. Okay, so why are there seasons? So hopefully the last slide answered the question of why is it hot at the equator and why is it cold at the poles? But we know that, like here in East Tennessee, for example, summers are hot and winters are cold. So what's up with that? Well, the reason for seasons is the Earth wobbles on its axis. So the Earth is tilted towards the sun, and as it orbits the Earth in a year, it means that different parts of the Earth are pointed directly at the sun at different times. So let's start in the middle of the summer here in Tennessee. So in the middle of the summer at the June solstice, the sun is shining over the Tropic of Cancer, which you can see is here represented by this dotted line. So just like we saw in the last slide, that means that there's a lot of solar radiation that's hitting directly here, and it's going to warm up the temperatures. So Florida is going to be really hot in June and July, right? As the Earth continues its orbit around the sun, as we get into the fall, you can't really see it here. You can see it up here. It's the same thing. During the fall in September, the sun is shining directly on the equator. So it's shining directly on this black line. Right? And so because it's shining directly here, that means at further latitudes like in East Tennessee, it's going to start to cool off. All right, as we transition into December, at the December solstice, now the sun is shining directly over the Tropic of Capricorn, right down here. Confusingly, what got me confused was oh no, they didn't. Now I'm just confused. Just delete the last 30 seconds of your life. I'm sorry. In December, the sun shines directly on the Tropic of Capricorn, which is down here in the southern hemisphere. And so that means the solar radiation is directly hitting here. And so that means it's going to be hot in the southern hemisphere. So when they're having summer, we're going to have winter up here in the northern hemisphere, because as we're tilted away, it means the sunlight is even more spread out, leading to cooler temperatures. And then as we move into spring, the sun is shining directly over the equator again, and so things are going to start to warm up for us as we transition into summer. So this is why when it's summer in the northern hemisphere, it's winter in the southern hemisphere. And this is also why it's hot pretty much year round, and there's not really a strong seasonality at the equator. That's because the equator gets hit directly 2 times per year. So that's a lot of heat, and there's not enough really, they're not far enough away from the equator in order to cool off significantly when they're angled away from the sun a little bit in December and June. Now you can see it here. This is just another representation of the same thing. So again, in June, the sun is shining directly up here at the Tropic of Cancer. Right, it's going to be hot. Down here, Tropic of Capricorn, the solar radiation is going to be spread out, so it's going to be cooler. And then 6 months later in December, it's the opposite. So now the sun is shining directly here in the southern hemisphere on the Tropic of Capricorn, and up here at the Tropic of Cancer at a higher latitude, more northern latitude, it's going to be spread out, so it's going to be colder. All right, it's also why when you're at the poles, right, or in Alaska, anywhere with really high latitude, this is why in the winter you have really long periods of darkness. It's because as the Earth rotates, it's angled away from the sun, and basically it remains in the dark. And then when it's the summertime, as the Earth rotates on its axis, the sun's going to keep shining. So the sun, you're going to have really long days with really long periods of daylight. Right? And so when you're at the North Pole or at the South Pole, that is going to be the most, you're going to see the most dramatic difference in daylight or daytimes between winter and summer. Right? And then that's going to decrease as you move towards the equator, meaning that at the equator you have more or less 12 hours of daylight each day, year round, more or less. So this is important. The reason we started with solar radiation is because the heat from the sun also drives air movement. And so if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that here at the equator, it gets hit directly by the sun twice per year. So that's going to heat air up, and hot air rises. And as the air rises, it's going to move higher into the atmosphere. And as it moves higher in the atmosphere, it cools. We'll talk about why in just a minute. And then it's going to eventually spread out. So some of it's going to go north, some of it's going to go south. And as it moves in those directions, it cools and eventually sinks. So you can see we get this cell of circulating air, warm air becoming cold. And it also turns out that as this air moves up, and because it's hot, it picks up a lot of evaporated water. And so this is warm, wet air that rises, and it ends up creating a lot of rain, and then this becomes dry air. So the Earth, I won't get into the other cells, but hopefully that made sense. So basically the Earth has these cells of cycling warm and cool air. Now these cells don't behave like you see in this picture. They actually shift in different directions. The reason for that is as the Earth spins on its axis, it moves these cells, it kind of stretches them out. You can see it over here on this side of the graphic. So this cell actually kind of rotates clockwise. This cell kind of rotates counterclockwise. This is something called the Coriolis effect. Again, it's a little bit complicated. We won't get into it now. When you take ecology later, we'll get into it in more detail. But the result is that these air masses, because of the rotation of the Earth, they get shifted right or left. And so you can see that in the northern hemisphere, it tends to get shifted to the right. Where we might expect the air to move due north, it may begin moving due north, but because of the rotation of the Earth, it gets deflected to the right. If it's moving due south, it gets deflected to the right. If it's moving due east, it gets deflected to the right. In the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite. So when it's moving north, it gets deflected left. If it's moving south, it gets deflected left. If it's moving east, it gets deflected left. Right? And that is why hurricanes spin in opposite directions in the northern and southern hemisphere. So this is the path of hurricanes, big storms that occur usually in the summer in the northern hemisphere. So basically solar radiation heats up the water, we get a lot of evaporation, and these cells of air start cycling. And so you can see that hurricanes will not only travel in this direction, but they will also spin. Well, I guess dang it. So they'll spin counterclockwise, my bad. They'll spin counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere, and that's because the air is getting deflected to the right. In the southern hemisphere, they spin clockwise because the air is getting deflected to the left. So they spin in opposite directions based on which hemisphere they're in. Notice that they're called hurricanes in the northern, or in the west, in the northern hemisphere. They're called typhoons in the east in the northern hemisphere, and they're called cyclones when they're in the east in the southern hemisphere. This also affects ocean currents. So, so ocean currents in the northern hemisphere are going to get moved counterclockwise. So, and let me go back to this. So you can see that these cells of air are going to bend to the right here, right? And if we look, the ocean currents will also bend to the right, right? So anyway, the point is that the wind currents that are caused by the phenomenon we just talked about are going to blow over the surface of the ocean, and they create these currents. And so some of these currents, the currents in the northern hemisphere, are going to end up cycling clockwise, and the ones in the southern hemisphere are going to cycle counterclockwise. You'll also see that much like the air, we get warm waters that are generated by the solar radiation at the equator that that will flow, and then as they come into contact with the poles, they're going to come into contact with colder water, and so these warm and cold currents will interact. And this is going to be really important for climate. Oh, there's the same thing. I forgot I had this on here. Same thing, just bigger. This is going to have a big implications for climate. So this is the Gulf Stream. So this is a warm water current that originates with warm waters in the Caribbean, and it moves up the coast of North America. It crosses the Atlantic, and it splits up over here, but some of it hits the British Isles and moves down and moves along the coast of Europe. Who cares? Well, this is why you can go swimming in Myrtle Beach and the water is bearable. So in other words, the water is relatively warm, and that's because that's warm water that's coming from the equator. And it also means that that warm water from the equator gets transported all the way to Britain, and that warm water helps warm the climate of the British Isles. So if you've ever been to England, it's pretty chilly, but it's not as chilly as it should be. In other words, their climate is more similar to like northeastern USA. Right? So in other words, this warm water helps mitigate the climate in the British Isles. All right? We also see something similar with the jet stream. So the jet stream is just this flow of air, and the jet stream is polar. So in other words, it's coming down from these higher latitudes and it's cold air. But the jet stream, sometimes it can be stable and just kind of circle the Earth like this, whereas other times it becomes wavy. And so when that happens, cold air can dip down. So in this case, or in this scenario, right, New England is going to be warm, so they're going to have some relatively warm days, whereas Alaska is going to be cold. In this scenario, the cold air dips down, and so we're going to get cold air in New England, and the warm air is going to move up, and so we're going to have warmer temperatures in Montana. So the movement of the jet stream is going to be responsible for short-term differences in climate. Here it is again. Cool. And just skip that. All right, we also have different climates based on proximity to the ocean. So there's continental climates and maritime climates. So in the graphic, you can see them both represented. So here we are, June through November. So this is in the northern hemisphere. Continental climates have warm summers and cold winters. Maritime climates have warmer winters than, the summer is warmer than the winter, but you see the difference isn't as great. All right, why is that? Well, in continental climates, you're dealing with a place that's in the middle of a continent. So consider Wichita, Kansas. Now it's cut off up here. I apologize for that. This is Kansas. This is California. So Kansas, if you didn't know, is in the middle of the United States. So it experiences a continental climate. So in the summer, when the sun is shining on Wichita, it heats up. It gets really hot. And then in the winter, when the sun isn't shining as directly on Kansas, the land cools off, it radiates heat, and they get really cold winters. Compare that with San Francisco. So this is the marine climate of San Francisco, California. So in the summer, it heats up, but in the winter, it cools off. But you can see the temperature range is a lot it doesn't fluctuate as much. The reason for that is the ocean basically helps mitigate those temperature swings. So in the summer, the ocean helps absorb some of that heat. In the winter, the ocean helps release some of that heat. So the ocean helps balance the temperature swings. So if you travel to San Francisco or San Diego, the temperature is always more or less even, um, regardless of season. They don't have hot summers and cold winters. But in the Midwest, um, that's just not true. Okay, precipitation is going to be really important for impacting climate. So really quick, let's talk about adiabatic cooling. So adiabatic cooling is a cooling caused by expansion rather than cooling caused by the loss of heat. So in other words, if you heated up a iron in the fire, it would get hot, and then when you took it away from the fire, it would radiate heat until eventually it was cool enough so that you could touch. That's just regular heating and cooling. Adiabatic cooling is a little bit different. So let's take a parcel of air. So this is a bubble representing just a packet of air. Maybe you could think of it as a balloon. You'll see that in the next slide. And initially, this packet of air, parcel of air, is 22 degrees Celsius. Right? As it increases in its elevation, there's less air pressure here, and so that parcel of air or that balloon is going to expand. And as it expands, there's more distance between the molecules, and so it's going to take them longer to bump into each other. And that's going to register a drop in temperature. So if you think of a thermostat, think of a thermometer as working in a way where every time a molecule bumps into it, it's going to tick up and register a warmer temperature. So at lower elevations, you're going to have fairly densely packed air, so they're all going to be bumping into each other, and we're going to register a higher temperature. At this elevation, the molecules are going to be spread out, so they're going to bump into the thermometer less frequently, so we're going to register a cooler temperature. And as we continue to go up, that temperature is going to get lower and lower. So adiabatic cooling just means that air is going to cool as it rises, because as it rises, it expands. So this means that anytime we have air rising, it's going to get colder. And this has implications because warm air can hold a lot of moisture. But as it cools off, it can't hold that moisture. So as that warm, wet air rises and cools from adiabatic cooling, the air expands, the temperature drops, and that parcel of air starts to drop its moisture, so it can be as rain or it can form clouds. Here's another example of that. So here's our thermometer measuring the temperature of a balloon at low altitude, and as it rises, it expands because the air pressure is dropping, and because it's expanding, it's undergoing adiabatic cooling, and so we're going to register that the temperature is dropping. Right? And if we flip that, if we take the cold, expanded air at high elevations and we drop it to a lower altitude, it's going to be compressed and it's going to warm up. So this is kind of like adiabatic heating, right? It's heating due to the compression or the increase in density of the air. Who cares? Why are we talking about this? Well, because it has implications for climate. So consider, say you're at the beach in the summer, and during the day the sun is shining on the land is heating up just like we saw it was in Kansas, and that warm air is going to rise, and as it rises it's going to form clouds, and then that warm air is going to move out over the ocean, and it's going to cool and it's going to sink, right? And as it sinks, it's then going to move in this direction, and so we're going to kind of get this cycling of air. So when you're at the beach in the summer, during the daytime, you'll get cool sea breezes during the daytime. At night, it's the opposite. The land cools off really quickly. The ocean is relatively warm compared to the land, and so you get warm air rising over the ocean. It's going to then move over the land. It's going to cool and descend, and it's going to flow back to the ocean. So at nighttime, you can get some pretty strong land breezes that occur at nighttime. Another example is the influence of topography on airflow. So whenever you have a mountain, the mountain is going to cause air to rise over it. And so in this example, this is representing California. So we get warm, wet air from the Pacific Ocean. It hits a coastal range of mountains. It rises. As it rises, it cools. And as it cools, it starts to drop moisture as precipitation, right? It's then going to sink and warm, and it's going to be relatively dry. Then it's going to hit this taller mountain range, the Sierra Nevadas, and it's going to rise and cool and drop more moisture as rain. It doesn't really show the rain here, but here it's going to cool even more. It's going to rain a lot, so this is going to be a wet area. And then as the air moves over the mountain, it's going to descend and warm up, and therefore it's going to be dry, and so we're going to have deserts. So if you've ever been to California, you get these rainforests of sequoia trees and redwood trees on the western slope of the Sierra Nevadas, and on the eastern slope it's hot and dry. Right? And so this results in rain shadow. So a rain shadow is simply dry habitats that are on the leeward side of a mountain or downwind of a mountain. So again, warm air, wet air, it rises and cools, it drops its moisture as precipitation, goes over the mountain and then descends and warms up, and so now it's dry. So this area is the rain shadow. Right? So why is the Nevada desert dry and hot? Why is Las Vegas in the middle of the desert? It's because to the west there's the Sierra Nevada mountains, and they basically soak up all of the moisture that's coming off the Pacific Ocean. So the Nevada desert is in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And this is the same thing, just another illustration. So moist rising air, get a bunch of rain, goes over the mountain, it drops and warms, and now it's dry. So you get rainforests on the western side in this example, and you get dry deserts on the eastern side in the rain shadow. All right, and then we've been talking about climate kind of on a large scale, but there's also microclimates. So a microclimate is simply the climate that immediately surrounds an organism. So, for example, here we see the sun is shining on a mountain, and on this side of the slope it's going to be hot and dry because it's sunny. This side is going to get more shade, and so you might have organisms or plants that are going to thrive in the shaded section, and different organisms and plants that are going to thrive in the sunny side. Even on the sunny side, you might get some beetles that are living under a log where it's nice and shady, or whatever. So the point is, most organisms are adapted to a microclimate. A beetle might be adapted to the shade over here, but it might be able to survive over here because it lives under the cool shade of a log. So many animals occupy these microclimates in order to survive in a larger climate that would otherwise be uninhabitable for them. All right, we'll pick up with global climate change. Oh, whoops. Hold on. Oh man, whoa, just bear with me. Whew. Whoa, okay, here we go. So this is why we see different precipitation patterns. All these reasons I've been talking about, all these factors I've been talking about. This is why we see the precipitation patterns that we do across the planet Earth. So let's start here where we've been discussing California. So a lot of rain, medium amount of rain, dry. That's because of rain shadow effect. Here in the middle of the continent, relatively dry because as water, the source of rain is primarily oceans and other bodies of water. So as the warm air or wet air from the oceans moves over the land, by the time it gets to the middle of the continent, it's dry. Down here in the southeast, it's relatively wet, and that's because warm, wet air comes out of the Atlantic Ocean and moves over, or the Gulf of Mexico, and moves over southeast. Right? Why is it dry here in the middle of Asia? Because it's really far away from the oceans. Why is it wet here, south of the Himalayas? And that's because warm air, wet air comes from the Indian Ocean, hits the mountains, drops it, and then we get rain shadow effect up here. What direction is the wind blowing in Australia? Well, it's blowing from the east to the west, so it's bringing moisture in from this direction, dropping the moisture as rain, and by the time the air gets to Western Australia, it's dry, and so we have deserts. So these patterns are all a function of solar radiation, wind patterns, ocean currents, and topography. Whew. Okay, global climate change is the next topic. See you next time.